Close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing in a muddy square somewhere in 14th century Europe. The sun is blazing. The smell of roasting meat mixes with horse dung and smoke from chimneys. And someone just dropped a bucket of fish guts at your feet. Merchants shout, beggars cry, children run around screaming. And you're here for, well, basically anything that won't poison you instantly. Welcome to the medieval market, where chaos, commerce, and curiosity collide. Today on History Lullaby, we're going to dive deep into the medieval marketplace, from the sticky honey cakes to the smelly cured meats, from the bizarre knickknacks to the over-ambitious street performers. By the end, you'll know why the medieval market was less a shopping trip and more an extreme survival experience, with a side of entertainment, fraud, and occasional rats. The medieval market was nothing short of organized chaos, a sensory assault designed to challenge even the hardiest traveler. From the moment the sun peeked over the horizon, spilling light across cobblestones slick with yesterday's rain and animal droppings, the market square came alive. Merchants hoisted crates of produce, shouting over one another with a volume that could shatter your eardrums. "Fresh bread, crisp and hot. Buy before it hardens into a weapon," someone yelled, while another, a fishmonger with an alarming mustache, waved a half-rotting herring like it was a prized relic. The smell alone was enough to make your stomach reconsider its choices. A melange of sweat, hay, manure, burning wood, and the sharp tang of unwashed bodies mingled with the faintly sweet scent of apples and the overly pungent stench of week-old cheese left out in the Sunday. You could feel the heat radiating off the crowd, the press of bodies, the tug of small children being dragged behind, and the occasional kick of a startled goat. The sounds were equally overwhelming. Merchants bellowed prices, vendors argued over the authenticity of their wares, and customers yelled back, disputing the price of a cabbage like it was a matter of life and death, which, in some sense, it was. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked incessantly, its nails scraping against stone, while a group of chickens squawked their complaints as a clumsy child tripped over them and fell headfirst into a pile of carrots. Juggling performers tried to maintain their act, sending clubs and flaming torches skyward while dodging the random kicks and shoves from passers-by, all the while hoping not to get flattened by a runaway donkey hauling a cart of apples. Every step was a gamble. Puddles of muddy water, broken cobblestones, and discarded bones provided perfect obstacles for unsuspecting feet. By the time you made it 20 paces, your shoes were wet, sticky, and coated in an aromatic patina of grime that seemed to adhere permanently. And the smells! If you were a visitor unfamiliar with the medieval market, the first inhalation would be enough to make you question your life choices. The stench of urine-soaked hay mixed with livestock manure was punctuated by the burning scent of wood and charcoal from cooks preparing early snacks. Steaming pies filled with mystery meat, roasted onions, and dumplings that had probably been sitting in a pan for a few days. Herbs and spices added a faintly sweet counterpoint to the otherwise overwhelming aroma. But you had to lean in close to appreciate it through the haze of smoke and human sweat. And yet, somehow, people navigated this olfactory minefield with astonishing ease. A noble in velvet robes would float past, ignoring the smell entirely, while a peasant family clutched the remnants of a stale loaf of bread, trying not to trip over the puddles or the vendor's goats. The visual chaos was equally spectacular. Nobles strutted through in layered silks and velvet, jeweled hats perched precariously atop their heads, their hair coiffed to defy gravity and any sense of practicality. Their long robes swept the mud like ceremonial scepters, and each movement was an advertisement for their wealth. Every inch of visible skin was carefully powdered, painted, or hidden under fabric, so fine it could probably have been weaponized. They were flanked by attendants and guards, whose job seemed more to prevent the nobles from being trampled than to maintain order in the market. Meanwhile, the peasant class hustled through the crowds in woolen tunics, patched boots, and scarves that had seen multiple winters. They carried baskets and sacks, their arms full of whatever scraps they could collect or purchase with coins painstakingly saved over the week. Children ran barefoot, dodging poultry and cattle alike, their shrieks adding to the general symphony of sound that defined the medieval marketplace. Merchants competed for attention with an almost theatrical flair. A baker would pound on his stall shouting, "Bread, hot bread, the crusty kind that will crack your teeth in the morning," while simultaneously holding a loaf aloft like a prize. A furrier displayed coats that would have been lethal in summer but were designed for winter bragging rights. Spices were sold by the pinch, with vendors teasing the aroma to entice buyers. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves, all mingling with the unmistakable scent of unwashed feet from the crowd, creating a bizarre but oddly intoxicating mix. Each stall was a small universe, meticulously organized chaos, where bargaining wasn't just expected, it was a sport. And it wasn't gentle sport. Insults, exaggerated gestures, and the occasional shove were par for the course. The sounds of haggling were punctuated by street performers. Jugglers, acrobats, and jesters paraded through the crowds, flipping coins and tossing wooden balls with reckless abandon. One acrobat, balancing on a tightrope stretched between two stalls, tripped and landed thankfully in a pile of hay, eliciting laughter from a group of children who had been chasing a pig moments earlier. Minstrels strummed lutes and fiddles, their tunes rising above the shouting, adding a soundtrack of melody to the cacophony. Occasionally, someone would try to dance along, stepping on toes and nearly colliding with a donkey laden with sacks of grain. And in a particularly chaotic corner, a magician waved his wand over a small cage of doves, apparently trying to convince a peasant that a single coin would guarantee the recovery of his sick cow. Interactions were a delicate dance. Nobles ignored peasants with practiced disinterest, while merchants ignored everyone except those with coins jingling convincingly. Peasants elbowed each other to grab the best produce, swapped gossip, and occasionally attempted to pick a coin from the unwary. Children darted between legs and under carts, testing their reflexes, agility, and occasionally patience. Thieves lurked in the shadows, taking advantage of the distractions. A purse snatched, a loaf of bread pinched, a coin replaced with a small stone. Every transaction, every gesture, every shuffle of feet was both a performance and a survival mechanism. Even the smallest details were laden with sensory input. The squelch of mud underfoot, the sticky residue of honey dripping from a vendor's cart, the sound of a pig squealing as it resisted being prodded into a pen, the faint metallic clang of a blacksmith demonstrating his wares all, combined into a near overwhelming experience. For an outsider, navigating the market was akin to surviving a miniature battlefield of smells, sounds, and social hazards. You had to know where to look, whom to avoid, and how to keep your dinner safe from sticky fingers and greedy dogs alike. Yet, despite all this, there was an undeniable energy to the market. It was the heartbeat of medieval society, a place where commerce, gossip, and entertainment collided in a spectacular fashion. Each vendor, merchant, and passerby contributed to a shared, chaotic rhythm that defined daily life. The market wasn't just about buying or selling. It was a stage where status, skill, and cleverness were tested. How fast could you snatch the last cabbage before the kid grabbed it? Could you dodge the chicken without losing your balance or dignity? Could you argue a fair price without drawing the ire of a jealous noble or a crafty merchant? Every day at the market was a lesson in observation, agility, and negotiation. And then there were the smells that could challenge even the most seasoned of noses. Raw fish, rotting vegetables, the pungent aroma of unwashed livestock, mixed with baked bread and the faint sweetness of early spring flowers. For the peasants, this was just background noise. For nobles, it was an assault to be endured while being fanned with exotic feathers. For visitors, it was a test of intestinal fortitude, stamina, and, occasionally, one's sense of humor. The aroma alone could knock you off your feet. Literally, if a donkey happened to wander too close. At its core, the medieval market was more than a place of commerce. It was a theater, a battle, a festival, and occasionally, a battlefield. It was a place where life, death, humor, and hardship collided in a soup of sensory chaos. You could trip over a chicken, inhale the aroma of week-old cheese, get elbowed by a child chasing a goat, dodge a juggler's flaming clubs, and still marvel at the sheer audacity of human organization and survival. It was disorder, but it was life. It was messy, smelly, exhausting, and yet, for those who lived it, it was essential. A place where people survived, thrived, argued, laughed, and occasionally lost a coin or a shoe to fate. So as we take a deep breath, step carefully over the mud and hay, and prepare to explore the goods, the food, the scams, and the spectacles of the medieval market, remember this: every shout, Every stink, every near collision tells the story of a society in motion. The market was the engine that powered medieval towns, a place of ingenuity, survival, and humor in equal measure. And if you've made it this far without stepping in something unpleasant, congratulations, you're already more prepared for medieval life than most visitors were. By the end of a single market day, you could lose your dignity, your shoes, and maybe a coin or two. But hey, at least you'd have stories, smells, and memories that would haunt you for the rest of your life. Navigating the medieval market was only the first challenge. The second, arguably more perilous, was figuring out what you were actually going to eat. Food in the Middle Ages was both a delight and a gamble. A sensory adventure where survival depended on both your stomach and your luck. The aromas of freshly baked bread mingled with the stink of spoiled fish, the sweetness of honeyed pastries mixed with the pungent tang of aged cheese, and the smoke from roasted meats cut through the air with a primal, mouth-watering intensity that could make a starving peasant forget all previous misfortunes, until the first bite reminded them why caution was essential. Bread was, of course, the backbone of the medieval diet. Thick, dense, and often far from fresh, it was more a tool for chewing practice than a culinary delight. A crust that could knock a coin out of your pocket and an interior as tough as old boots meant that eating bread required dedication, jaw strength, and occasionally a prayer. Every town had its bakers, each claiming their loaves were superior. But the reality was often soggy middles, burned edges, or the occasional shard of grit from the millstones. Peasants might be grateful for stale bread that filled the stomach, but nobles, with their polished teeth and delicate palates, had to contend with imported flours, rare spices, and so-called fine bread, which probably tasted just as hard and dry, but came with a story about the lord who paid for it. Cheese, the next staple, was a mixed bag, literally. Fresh cheese could be creamy, but aged cheese, left unrefrigerated in the summer sun, often became a pungent, almost weaponized substance. Roasted, boiled, or added to pottage, it was both a flavor enhancer and a potential hazard. A single miscalculation could leave your tongue tingling, your stomach rebelling, and your neighbors politely avoiding eye contact as you doubled over. Meat was reserved for special occasions or for those who could afford livestock. When it appeared at market stalls, it often came with a risk assessment attached. This chicken was alive yesterday. Maybe. Fish, while more accessible for those near rivers or coasts, was similarly dubious. Smelly, oily, and often a little too fresh or too old. Eating fish required trust, a strong constitution, and perhaps a small offering to the gods that you wouldn't regret your decision. Pottage was the great equalizer of medieval dining. A simple stew of grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables were on hand, pottage could sustain a person for hours of backbreaking labor. But it also came with a risk of accidental horror. Did the cook add a poisonous weed by mistake? Was that chunk of root actually edible? You didn't know, and there was no Yelp to warn you. Every spoonful was a calculated gamble, a tiny adventure into survival. Soldiers marching across the countryside relied heavily on pottage and bread, carried in leather sacks, sometimes warmed over campfires with whatever herbs they could scrounge. These were the first real portable energy foods, designed for stamina and endurance rather than pleasure. Ale and beer, thick, foamy, and often barely distinguishable from yesterday's porridge, were a daily staple. Water, when available, was suspicious at best, and often a vector for disease. So you drank beer or ale, not for taste, though some were pleasantly bitter, but because it was safer than the alternatives. Workers would down liters of the stuff before heading back to the fields, carrying their own bread and cheese for the midday meal. And yes, nobles enjoyed wine, but even that could be unpredictable. The fermentation process was a little less controlled than modern vintners, resulting in bottles that were occasionally fizzy, often sour, and sometimes potent enough to knock a man over before his first sip. Snacks, if you could call them that, were more survival tools than culinary indulgences. Nuts, dried fruits, hard biscuits, and salted meat offered calories on the go. Markets offered pies and pastries, though these were often as dangerous as they were delicious. A meat pie could be your salvation, filling the belly and giving the energy needed for another hour of hauling firewood. But it could also harbor spoiled meat, insect eggs, or a crust so thick it doubled as a weapon. And yet peasants and travelers ate it anyway. Sure, that pie smells weird. They would shrug. But it's either eat it or starve choice made. Even a single misstep in judging freshness could lead to hours of regretting your decision, or worse. Spices and condiments were the domain of the wealthy. Saffron, cinnamon, and cloves were rare and precious, used sparingly to enhance meat or wine. For the average person, a pinch of wild garlic or a sprig of parsley was as luxurious as it got. The sense of taste was often secondary to survival. Food needed to fill the stomach and keep the body working through the day's labor. Whether that meant tilling fields, hauling water, or mending fences in the relentless Sunday, markets and street vendors added another layer of sensory overload. Stalls offered roasted meats, fresh vegetables, and confections that might resemble modern pastries but were denser, grittier, and designed to last a day of exposure. The aroma of roasting meat competed with the less savory smells of unwashed bodies and animal waste, creating a complex perfume that only the most seasoned market-goers could navigate without gagging. Street performers hawked miracle foods, drinks infused with mysterious herbs, and fried dough that was more sugar and oil than sustenance, but brought fleeting joy to the laborers. Children often ran ahead, clutching small pieces of bread or leftover meat, dodging chickens and goats while nibbling as they went. Their survival instinct was honed from the start. Grab what you can, eat before someone else does, and be ready to jump out of the way of the next donkey cart barreling through the square. Peasants might barter over the price of a cabbage while keeping one wary eye on their food. Nobles, on the other hand, often carried their meals in satchels, untouched by the grit, smoke, and chaos that surrounded them. And then there were the exotic curiosities. Festivals or market days sometimes offered unusual treats: candied fruits preserved in honey, spiced meats cooked with imported nuts, or pastries infused with ingredients so rare that they were worth more than a peasant's week's wages. These foods weren't just for eating. They were status symbols, entertainment, and sometimes a hazard. One misstep, one wrong bite, and your stomach could be engaged in a medieval reenactment of Dante's Inferno. Hydration, too, was a gamble. Water from wells or streams could be dubious, sometimes teeming with parasites. Beer or ale, while not exactly refreshing, offered a safer alternative. Soldiers marching into battle, laborers breaking stones, and peasants tending livestock all relied on these beverages, not for pleasure, but because they were unlikely to poison you immediately. In essence, the medieval diet was a constant negotiation between necessity, taste, and survival instinct. Despite the dangers, food also provided a form of entertainment, a brief reprieve from the relentless grind of medieval life. Sweet pastries, fried dough, and ale offered small joys in an otherwise exhausting world. Sharing a meal with neighbors, laughing over a particularly suspicious pie, or marveling at a vendor's skill in juggling oranges while keeping your dinner intact was as much about community as it was about sustenance. Humor was, in fact, an essential ingredient. You might choke on a bit of gristle, inhale a cloud of flour, or trip over a stray goat, but laughing at the absurdity of it all helped the day pass just a little easier. By the time the sun hung high over the square, the market had transformed into a true theater of survival. People jostled, shouted, and ate in rapid succession, performing an intricate dance of hunger, patience, and human folly. A single trip could involve nearly everything: dodging livestock, bargaining with a butcher, snatching bread from a distracted child, and keeping one eye on your coin purse to avoid thievery. The smells, sights, and sounds combined to create an experience that was chaotic, exhausting, and oddly exhilarating. You might have eaten a slightly questionable meat pie, inhaled the scent of 100 different cheeses, and gotten elbowed in the ribs by a kid chasing a goat. But hey, at least you didn't starve. Medieval meals, part hazard, part survival, and entirely memorable. As you stumble through the crowded medieval marketplace, still clutching the slightly suspicious meat pie you grabbed for breakfast, your eyes are inevitably drawn to the strangest of sights. Among the shouting vendors and the cacophony of animals, merchants hawk goods that range from the utterly practical to the mind-bogglingly bizarre, creating a sensory overload that could overwhelm even the most seasoned market-goer. The smells alone are enough to make you question your life choices. Layers of spices, herbs, and incense mingle with the unmistakable aroma of old leather, wet wool, and, for some inexplicable reason, a hint of goat. Every inhale is an adventure, You're never quite sure if it's a fragrant saffron stall or a pile of dried rat skins someone is trying to pass off as medicinal. Exotic spices are among the most coveted treasures, often displayed in small, colorful pouches that emit perfume-like clouds into the air. Cloves, cinnamon, and pepper traveled across deserts and seas to reach these muddy streets, each grain worth more than a peasant's weekly wage. The rich flock here, running their fingers over the glossy powders while inhaling deeply, imagining a roast chicken infused with flavors they'll never cook for themselves. For the average market goer, these spices were both temptation and torture. A reminder that flavor existed somewhere beyond pottage and stale bread, yet completely out of reach. Dried herbs are everywhere, some neatly bundled, others spilling from cracked baskets like a green and brown confetti explosion. Lavender for calming, rue for protection, sage for cooking and medicine, and a mysterious root that, according to the vendor, could ward off the devil or your mother-in-law, whichever comes first. The more superstitious shoppers paw at these bundles, whispering charms under their breath and sniffing to see if they'll gain the blessing of the herb's power. Meanwhile, the more skeptical nudge each other, wondering if the whole thing is just an elaborate ruse. And of course, there are feathers piles of them in every color of the rainbow, some bright and exotic, others dull and floppy. Nobles buy them for their hats, believing the bigger and more flamboyant the feather, the more attention it commands in the court or at the market fair. Peasants, with their practical tunics, glance at the feathers with a mix of envy and bewilderment. Why would anyone wear something that looks like a bird exploded on your head? But in the medieval world, fashion and status were inseparable, and a single peacock plume could elevate a person's perceived importance in the eyes of the crowd. Imported silks glimmer in the sun, draped across wooden poles, swaying in the breeze as though performing their own private dance. The textures are soft and luxurious, a sharp contrast to the coarse, scratchy wools of the common folk. For the wealthy, these silks are more than clothing. They are statements, proof that you have connections stretching across kingdoms and empires. For the poor, they are window-shopping dreams, impossible fantasies fluttering just out of reach. Each bolt of silk comes with a story, often involving caravans, deserts, and the occasional camel mishap, which the merchant recounts at high volume to make the item seem more valuable. Magic charms and miracle cures crowd the market stalls like weeds, each claiming to solve problems from the mundane to the life-threatening. Bottles of powdered unicorn horn, pouches of crushed gemstones, vials of dubious liquids labeled as elixir of vitality or liquid courage litter the tables. Old women cackle over their stalls, waving small bones or dried herbs, offering blessings for the price of a coin and a promise to ward off the plague, or perhaps just ward off bad luck at the market. Children glance nervously, wondering if anyone actually bought this stuff. And of course, some did, because when in doubt, why not spend your last few coins on a talisman promising eternal health or immediate wealth? Weapons and tools are another chaotic feature of the market. Blunted swords, mismatched daggers, and poorly forged axes sit alongside sturdy hammers, sickles, and ropes coiled neatly, or not so neatly, in the dust. Apprentices and young workers handle the tools, occasionally getting nipped by a loose blade or banged by a wayward hammer. Meanwhile, the adults haggle loudly over the price of a new plowshare, because in the medieval world, nothing says negotiation like risking your fingers over a chunk of iron. Even peasants learn quickly that survival depends not just on what you can eat, but on what you can wield. Bizarre household items abound. Mortar and pestle sets made of stone, mysterious contraptions for grinding grain, leather pouches rumored to keep mice away, and candles that burn twice as long if you chant a little rhyme. Every item comes with a promise, half true and half laughable. You might purchase a set of oddly shaped spoons, only to realize they are meant for measuring herbs in a herbalist's apothecary, rather than eating your pottage. Yet the novelty alone makes it worth the price for the curious and the wealthy alike. Scams and charlatans are as much a part of the market as the goods themselves. Vendors with dramatic flair promise cures for ailments with jars of snake oil, claiming it can fix everything from toothache to a broken heart. For a gold coin, they might throw in powdered unicorn horn and a smattering of dried herbs that smell suspiciously like last week's leftovers. Street performers often double as salesmen, juggling knives while extolling the virtues of a healing charm. The crowd is a mix of awe, skepticism, and outright panic, as the more gullible step forward to hand over their coins. And don't forget the thieves and pickpockets, weaving through the throng with the skill of a cat burglar. While everyone's nose is occupied with the scent of roasting meat or the sweetness of honeyed pastries, a nimble hand might relieve you of a few coins. It's survival of the fittest, medieval edition, where vigilance is just as important as hunger or fashion. Even the social theater of the market adds to the chaos. Nobles strut through in freshly polished boots and silk garments, attempting to assert authority while avoiding mud puddles and the occasional goat. Peasants scurry to finish errands, dragging baskets heavy with food and firewood, trying not to step in anything unpleasant. Everyone has a role, and the market is the stage on which it plays out daily. A microcosm of medieval life in miniature, punctuated by loud bargaining, braying animals, and the occasional theatrical collapse when a barrel of apples tips over. The more you wander, the more you realize that the market isn't just about commerce, it's about survival, storytelling, and spectacle. Every merchant's pitch is an invitation to play a game of risk versus reward, whether it's trying a suspicious pastry, buying a supposedly miraculous charm, or picking out a dagger that might actually cut something beside your finger. For peasants, the market is a place to stretch coins, gather necessities, and occasionally witness the absurdity of the wealthier classes. For nobles, it's a place to flaunt status, taste the rare and exotic, and indulge in curiosities that remind them they are superior, at least until they trip over a stray chicken and tumble into a pile of hay. Buy a jar of snake oil, a powdered unicorn horn, and hope it fixes your cough guaranteed or your coin back. Probably not. In the meantime, dodge the goat, the falling barrel, and that kid with a stick. Welcome to the medieval market. Part bazaar, part circus, and entirely unforgettable. As you weave further into the bustling medieval market, your senses assaulted by smells of roasting meat, pungent cheeses, and the faintly acrid tang of unwashed livestock, another layer of chaos unfurls before your eyes. Amid the clatter of coins, the braying of goats, and the shouts of merchants hawking their wares, there exists a spectacle unlike any other. The medieval performers, entertainers, and street artists who transform the market from a simple place of trade into a cacophonous theater of the absurd. These performers are as much a part of the market as the stalls themselves, each one desperate for attention, each one promising delight, danger, or at least a story that you will recount with wide-eyed disbelief over a slightly burned stew later in the day. Jugglers are the first to catch your eye, arms ablur as they toss knives, apples, and sometimes flaming torches into the air, all while grinning like the chaos they create is entirely intentional. The crowd gathers in a rough semicircle, gasping and laughing in equal measure. The acrobats flip and tumble across makeshift platforms, occasionally landing in hay piles or knocking over a basket of eggs with dramatic flair. And you, navigating the throng, suddenly find yourself ducking to avoid a rolling loaf of bread or a misjudged jug of water. Survival requires alertness, agility, and a sense of humor qualities honed not in a palace, but on the cobblestones of this medieval arena. Musicians, meanwhile, attempt to compete for attention in the same space, their fiddles screeching, drums pounding, and flutes shrieking to be heard over the clamor. Every few minutes, a bard or storyteller raises his voice, spinning tales of dragons, brave knights, or tragic romances, often pausing to dramatically gesture at a bewildered member of the crowd who may or may not have volunteered for the role of villain. Children squeal with delight or flee in terror depending on the intensity of the performance, while adults nod, pretend to understand the moral, and discreetly reach into their coin purses. Audience interaction is both mandatory and potentially dangerous. If a juggler is doing a particularly ambitious routine with knives, the nearest spectator, perhaps you, is expected to lean in with awe, cheer at the right moment, and, crucially, not interfere. Failure to do so could result in a knife slipping dangerously close, or worse, a flaming torch landing on your foot. The polite clap and polite gasps of the crowd are your only hope of survival. And yes, these performers are professionals, but even the best acrobat occasionally misjudges a leap or a flip, sending you ducking, hopping, or swearing in ways you hadn't thought possible before breakfast. Street theatrics extend beyond mere physical feats. Mimes act out exaggerated versions of everyday life. A merchant haggling with a ghostly customer, a drunkard getting caught in a windmill, or a noble attempting to mount a horse too small for his ego. Puppeteers manipulate marionettes with an alarming skill, their wooden figures reenacting famous battles or local gossip with uncanny accuracy. You can hear children laughing, peasants groaning at the implied insults toward their overlords, and merchants muttering under their breath about how these fools might be distracting customers. It's a sensory explosion. Sights, sounds, smells, and occasional smoke from a poorly managed torch combine to create an experience simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. The performers often operate on a pay-what-you-can-survive principle. A few coins tossed into a hat or a begging bowl will earn you some attention, or at least a chance of not being included in the act as a human prop. Refuse, and you may suddenly find yourself the unlucky subject of a jester's mockery, a target for a tossed custard pie, or an unwitting participant in a slapstick scene that leaves your dignity and maybe your hat in tatters. The performers thrive on chaos, and the line between spectator and performer is surprisingly thin. Some of the most audacious acts involve fire, balance, and sharp objects. A performer will spin flaming torches while standing on a barrel perched precariously on a tightrope. Or at least, what passes for a tightrope on the muddy market street. The crowd gasps in unison as he teeters, one misstep away from disaster. You shuffle backward, narrowly avoiding being trampled, and simultaneously consider tossing him a coin out of sheer admiration or out of terror, because it's safer to pay for your life than your amusement. Animals, of course, are frequently incorporated into these acts, often to chaotic effect. Monkeys, geese, or even the occasional goat are trained to perform tricks or retrieve objects. Although the line between clever tricks and random mayhem is notoriously thin. You might see a monkey grab a loaf of bread from a distracted vendor while the juggler is mid-spin, creating a domino effect of yelling, flailing limbs, and terrified chickens. The smells, sweat, hay, animal musk, and the faint hint of urine combine to form a perfume unique to medieval entertainment. One that makes modern-day theme parks feel quaint in comparison. The soundscape is equally anarchic. Lutes, flutes, horns, drums, and the occasional unamplified scream of a performer thrown off balance mingle with the clamor of the marketplace. Children shout in imitation. Dogs bark, and peasants argue over the price of onions in a frenzy of competitive bargaining. Even the nobles can't escape the auditory assault. Their polished boots echo against the stone streets, while their finery catches mud and grime. The market is alive, breathing, and sometimes spitting fire in more ways than one. Interaction between performers and audience is mandatory. You might suddenly find yourself part of a mock duel, required to hold a stick and pretend it's a lance. Or a storyteller may grab a coin from your purse mid-gesture, declaring you a contributor to the arts while balancing on one foot. Children will try to copy the acts, often with tragicomic results. Flailing limbs, smashed pies, or overturned baskets, reminding everyone that chaos is, in fact, the main form of entertainment. Yet beneath the chaos, there is skill and social function. Performers are not just here to amuse. They are teaching lessons about timing, dexterity, negotiation, and perhaps most importantly, resilience. You learn quickly that to survive a market day, you need to be observant, quick on your feet, and able to laugh at near disasters. If a juggler's knives miss their mark, it's up to the audience to react appropriately. Gasp, clap, or step aside, sometimes all at once. The humor of it all is unavoidable. A clown trips over a stray chicken while tossing pies, sending a custard explosion across the crowd, narrowly missing the noble's embroidered sleeve but thoroughly coating a child's hair. A drunk performer attempts to walk a tightrope, toppling a barrel and sending apples rolling into a vendor's pot of soup. And yet, the market thrives. People scream, laugh, and barter, all in the same breath, because this is life. Messy, unpredictable, and thoroughly immersive. For all its madness, the street entertainment also serves as a bridge between classes. Nobles may watch from a distance, careful not to soil their silks, while peasants mingle closer to the performers, appreciating skill over status. Children learn to navigate chaos. Merchants learn negotiation under duress. And everyone participates in a form of social cohesion that is uniquely medieval. Humor, danger, and spectacle all coexist in this shared experience. Humorous observation. To close section 4, a juggler drops a flaming torch on your foot. Do you yelp? Applaud? Faint from terror? That's just Tuesday in the medieval market. You'll inhale a cloud of incense, dodge a goat, and somehow still come home with a chicken leg in one hand and a bag of herbs in the other, wondering if you've just survived or earned a gold medal in chaos management. By now, your senses are on overload. You've dodged flaming torches, narrowly avoided a flying apple, and inhaled enough incense and roasted meat to last a week. But the real spectacle, the one that doesn't require acrobatics or juggling knives, is the living, breathing hierarchy of the medieval marketplace. Step into the center of the square and you'll see it unfold like a carefully orchestrated, if chaotic, dance. Merchants shouting their wares, buyers scurrying to inspect, nobles striding past in layers of silk, peasants balancing baskets on their heads, and beggars weaving through the crowd with practiced stealth. Every person in the square knows their place, but just like the juggling act earlier, the performance teeters constantly on the edge of chaos. Merchants are the first actors in this theater of social cues. They are loud, brash, and trained to make their goods irresistible, sometimes to the point of absurdity. A spice vendor will hold up a jar of saffron, describing it in florid terms as sunlight ground into threads, distilled by angels, while a skeptical noble leans in, nose wrinkled at the scent of dried petals and dust. Peasants can only dream of such luxury, craning their necks to see the colored powders they'll never afford. But the peasants aren't helpless. They've been raised in the art of bartering, and they know how to inspect a bean or measure a loaf of bread to ensure it isn't a fraud. Every gesture, nod, or frown is loaded with meaning. A twitch of the eyebrow could lower a price by a coin or two. A sniff could condemn a batch of apples as unfit for human consumption. Haggling is both an art and a sport. Nobles can charm a merchant into lowering a price with a wink or a well-placed compliment, and the merchant smiles, enjoying the game because he knows the noble has wealth to back it up. Peasants, on the other hand, approach with a quiet intensity, their eyes calculating, their hands gripping every coin. Speak too loudly, act too desperate, and suddenly your chance at a loaf of bread disappears. Or worse, the town crier might decide your audacity is entertainment for the crowd. Every transaction is a microdrama. The exchange of goods and money, the reading of faces, the subtle negotiation of status. In the medieval marketplace, even a mundane purchase of garlic is rife with tension and social cues. Nobles, with their layers of velvet, fur, and silk, move through the marketplace like moving islands of wealth. Servants carry their goods, protect their masters, and constantly adjust garments so that no hem touches the mud. The smell of perfume and horse sweat follows them in equal measure. Their every step is calculated, their posture perfected, because every movement communicates their social standing. A noble might stop at a stand and pick up a loaf of bread, inspecting it as if it were a rare gem, while peasants bow and avert their eyes, silently acknowledging the imbalance of power. And yet, even nobles are not immune to the chaos of the marketplace. A loose chicken or an errant dog can trip up silk shoes, leaving a master hopping and hissing like a human marionette. Peasants, by contrast, are like shadows among the color and noise, moving with purpose and efficiency. They carry baskets, weigh coins, and check the freshness of vegetables, all while avoiding carts, horses, and noble feet. Their clothing is practical coarse wool and linen, often patched multiple times. But it allows them to maneuver, to lift, to reach, and to survive the crush of the crowd. Survival here is literal. A misstep could mean a spilled basket, a bruised shin, or a confiscated coin by a more assertive buyer. And despite their position at the bottom of the hierarchy, peasants are experts at reading social cues. They know exactly when to hunker down, when to smile, and when to quietly back away from a noble who decides he wants that last cabbage. And then there are the beggars, the invisible yet essential actors of the market stage. They move like ghosts, threading through gaps between stalls, occasionally holding out a hand or an empty bowl. Some are cunning, blending in with the crowd, dropping a coin in a distracted merchant's lap, or stealing a crust of bread under the noble's oblivious nose. Others are theatrical, groaning and gesturing wildly, invoking sympathy or shame. Every beggar is a test of perception for the buyer. Do you give? Do you ignore? Or do you throw a coin and move on, hoping the spectacle doesn't turn on you? Survival for the beggar is about timing, skill, and perhaps a bit of luck, because in a space where everyone has a role, failing to perform correctly can result in hunger, humiliation, or the occasional slap. The interplay between classes is subtle, yet striking. Nobles expect obedience, peasants demand fairness, merchants seek profit, and everyone has to navigate a minefield of social norms without tipping over the delicate balance. This is where the humor of medieval markets truly shines. The same crowd that cheers for a juggler also glares at a peasant daring to speak too loudly or a noble trying to sneak a discount. The marketplace is a living stage, a place where society demonstrates its structure daily, where etiquette, wealth, and survival intersect in a messy, colorful display. Food also plays a critical role in this theater of hierarchy. Nobles will sample spiced meats, exotic fruits, and delicacies brought from far-off lands. Savoring flavors unknown to the common folk, peasants stick to what is available: coarse bread, thin cheese, root vegetables, or the occasional piece of salted pork. And yet, even in scarcity, ingenuity thrives. Peasants may smuggle a slice of pie from a market stall, hide a few dried fruits in their tunics, or barter cleverly to extend a meager ration. Every transaction is imbued with strategy, wit, and a touch of desperation. Humorously, social conventions dictate much of the interaction. If a noble haggles, it's charming. A playful negotiation, a bit of banter, maybe even a wink. If a peasant haggles, it might draw a scowl, a warning, or even a shove, because the social rules are inverted, and perception is everything. A noble can be eccentric. A peasant must be clever and cautious. Misread a signal, and you might end up giving away more than intended or getting cursed by a merchant who thinks you've insulted their honor. The cacophony of sounds, merchants shouting, animals braying, children squealing, coins clinking, drums beating from a nearby performer creates a kind of auditory armor. You learn to navigate by rhythm and volume, interpreting the chaos to your advantage. A noble's voice will cut through the din. A peasant must use body language and quick thinking. Survival is literal, but so is performance. Everyone in the market is performing, whether they know it or not. By the end of the day, it's a symphony of motion, sound, and scent. Mud squelches underfoot. The smoke from cooking fires mixes with the earthy smell of manure, and the air is thick with the tension of bargaining and the perfume of extravagance. Nobles leave with exotic items and a sense of superiority. Peasants leave with what they can carry, and beggars leave with whatever scraps remain. Everyone survives, some slightly richer, some slightly humbler, and all slightly more exhausted. The market has reset, ready to do it all again tomorrow. If a noble haggles, it's charming. If a peasant haggles, you might lose your life, metaphorically or literally. Step carefully, speak carefully, and never underestimate the power of a vendor wielding a rolling pin. If navigating the noise, the smell, and the throng of people wasn't enough, you also had to contend with the sticky, glittering, utterly maddening world of medieval money. Coins clinked in leather pouches, jangling as peasants jostled their way through the crowd, trying not to lose a single one to a pickpocket with nimble fingers and a practiced smile. Bartering was an art, and every merchant had a trick up their sleeve. One peasant might be carrying enough coins to buy a week's worth of bread, while a noble could spend an entire bag of gold on a single trinket and think nothing of it. In this swirl of clinking metal, everyone learned quickly that value wasn't always what it seemed. Coinage in the Middle Ages was complicated enough to make your head spin. There were gold coins, silver coins, copper coins, and even tokens issued by local lords or monasteries that could only be spent at specific stalls or taverns. One day, a copper penny might buy a loaf of bread. The next, a noble's whim could inflate prices so much that a handful of coins bought you nothing more than a sniff of a roasted goose. Peasants and merchants alike had to be constantly aware of weight, shape, and markings, because a counterfeit coin could mean losing both your purchase and your dignity. Imagine thinking you'd finally snagged a juicy cabbage only to realize that the coin you handed over had been hollowed out and stuffed with lint by a clever child earlier that morning. That cabbage is now technically free, but your trust in the world is permanently diminished. Haggling was the lifeblood of the marketplace. For nobles, it was almost a game, a charming little ritual in which words flowed like wine and gestures were measured to project both wealth and benevolence. Ah, 5 coins for this silken scarf? Surely, my dear merchant, "You jest," they would say, their laughter carrying across the square. And the merchant would bow, eyes twinkling with the knowledge that the noble could, and probably would, pay 10 if necessary. Meanwhile, peasants had a different kind of haggling. The edge of your seat. Every coin counts negotiation where one misstep could mean parting with your last coin or walking away with nothing but shame. Every glance, every hesitation, every bit of body language was scrutinized. A frown, a snort, a pause could lower the price or provoke the wrath of a merchant who had seen too many cheap peasants testing their patience. Survival tactics in the marketplace were as varied as the goods themselves. Some peasants carried small knives hidden in their sleeves to defend their coins. Others would disguise heavy stones as coins to throw off would-be thieves. Clever merchants sometimes had mirrors strategically placed to spot pickpockets, or had apprentices shadowing every transaction like mini watchdogs. A sudden commotion, a dropped basket, a clattering barrel could be a diversion, a test, or a full-on scam, and everyone had to react instantly. One false step, and you might be out a coin, a loaf of bread, or a hard-earned turnip. Speaking of scams, the creativity of medieval tricksters was something to behold. Some merchants sold jars of magical powders, claiming they could cure fever, promote growth, or enhance wit. Others offered enchanted bread that supposedly gave you strength beyond normal mortals. Often stale, laced with a bit of dust. But hey, faith was included at no extra charge. Pickpockets and street urchins formed their own guilds of cleverness, knowing exactly when a distracted noble or a bargaining peasant could be lightened of their purse. The marketplace was a delicate dance of trust, suspicion, and pure luck, and every participant played their role with serious intent or delightful mischief. Barter was also a critical skill, especially for the lower classes. If you were a peasant, you didn't just hurl coins at the first merchant you saw. You had to know the weight of your silver, the quality of your produce, and the reputation of the stall owner. You'd wave your cabbage, mumble about quality, and point out the imperfections in the merchant's tomatoes, all while avoiding eye contact with a passing noble who might decide to interfere simply because he's bored. Every transaction was a tiny battlefield where wit, observation, and nerve could mean the difference between a full stomach and empty hands. Humor and absurdity peppered the marketplace as much as it did the fashion or entertainment. Imagine handing over a coin for a cabbage, only to discover later that the coin was hollowed out and contained a tiny piece of chalk, or worse, that a mischievous child had already taken a bite of your cabbage while you were distracted by a juggler's flaming torches. You'd frown, you'd stomp your foot, but deep down, you'd know this was just another Tuesday in the medieval square. And yet, these little absurdities were the glue that held social interactions together. They created stories, gossip, and laughter, even in the harsh realities of daily survival. Drinks in the marketplace were another arena for mischief and haggling. Vendors sold ale, cider, or spiced wines in large wooden cups, often thick, foamy, and more than a little suspect. The aroma alone could make you hesitate. Sour, sweet, slightly fermented, and occasionally mixed with a surprise ingredient. But thirst waits for no one. You paid your coin, grabbed your cup, and hoped for the best. Nobles might sip delicately, holding the cup as if it were a chalice, while peasants downed it in a single gulp, eyes watering, stomach churning, but energy restored. And if you were unlucky, a jostle in the crowd could spill half your drink into the dirt or onto your neighbor, prompting a very medieval display of shouting and gesturing. The currency of respect, too, was measured in both coin and cunning. If a noble showed favor to a merchant, prices might be dropped, apprentices might be rewarded, and the crowd would murmur approval. If a peasant spoke out of turn, they might receive a scolding, a shove, or the cold shoulder. Everyone in the market knew their place, but those who mastered the art of perception could stretch their coin further and survive another day. Every nod, bow, and gesture carried weight, and a single miscalculation could tip the balance. Even the smells of the marketplace played into this social currency. The stench of manure, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies was overwhelming, and navigating through it required strategy. Merchants placed spices and herbs near their stalls to entice buyers and mask less pleasant odors. Peasants learned to sniff the air, judging which meat was safe, which vegetables were fresh, and which ale could be consumed without immediate regret. It was a world where sensory acuteness was as important as verbal skill and social savvy. By late afternoon, the market transformed yet again. Shoppers were exhausted but richer or poorer, depending on luck and skill. Coins were lighter, baskets fuller, and the stories of narrowly avoided scams and clever barters were already circulating among those who had survived. The cacophony began to soften as vendors closed their stalls. Animals were herded away, and the sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the muddy square. And yet, the lessons of the day were clear. Observation, timing, humor, and quick thinking were as essential to survival as any coin or cabbage. Paying a coin for a cabbage? Make sure it's not hollowed out for a snack by someone else. And always watch your back, somewhere between the juggler, the pickpocket, and the noble with a sharp tongue. The market has more plots than a monk's manuscript. By the time the sun climbed high and baked the cobblestones underfoot, the market had begun to blur into a festival that smelled strongly of roasting meat, spilled ale, and the faintly terrifying odor of animals that clearly weren't planning to stay put. Stalls jostled for attention with colorful banners and dancing ribbons. Acrobats flailed dangerously close to spectators, and children ran amok, shrieking as if it were a sacred obligation. This was the medieval fair in all its chaotic glory, and while it might look like a scene of pure fun, it came with a healthy side of danger. Not just from rogue jugglers or misfired pies, mind you, but from the very air you breathed, the mud under your boots, and the food in your hand. Rats scuttled confidently across the market, unbothered by the crowds, weaving through baskets of vegetables and occasionally leaping for a discarded bit of bread. Flies buzzed like tiny trumpets, announcing your imminent doom, circling hungrily around meat pies that, to a modern eye, looked less appetizing and more like an experiment in bacterial growth. One could almost admire the resilience of a medieval peasant, navigating the square with baskets balanced on hips, dodging livestock, avoiding falling sausages, all while trying not to step in what passed for sanitation at the time. The air itself was a blend of smells that no modern perfumer could replicate. Smoke from cooking fires, the pungency of unwashed bodies, the tang of fermented beverages, and the faint but undeniable stench of animal waste. It was like inhaling a symphony composed entirely of bad decisions. Amid this chaos, market doctors and herbalists made their rounds. These figures were a curious mix of hopeful healers and opportunistic quacks, traveling from stall to stall, offering cures for anything from a minor headache to what we now know was likely dysentery. One could spot them by their jars of herbs, little pouches of dried roots, and occasionally by the eerie glint of a silver amulet hanging from their neck, supposed to ward off the evil eye. If someone sneezed or coughed too loudly, the herbalist would appear as if by magic, offering a dubious potion that smelled somewhere between rotting cabbage and burnt licorice. No one knew if it helped, but they paid anyway. Part superstition, part fear, part better than nothing, I guess. Eating at the fair carried its own set of hazards. Meat pies, roasted fowl, and fried dough were everywhere, but freshness was a relative term. A pie that had been left in the sun for half a day might be safe for consumption if you squinted and held your nose just right. Fish, if you could call it that, sometimes still carried the aroma of the river it came from, or the week-old marsh it had briefly occupied before becoming dinner. Fruit could be bruised, vegetables infested with worms, and bread often contained more grit than actual grain. One could easily see why medieval hygiene and food safety were not exactly household priorities. And yet, people ate. They ate with gusto, because in a world where survival was a daily negotiation, hunger was a more pressing concern than germs. The festival itself was a strange mix of piety and revelry. Religious observances, saintly parades, and processions mingled with games of skill and chance. Nobles watched from raised platforms, tipping performers or tossing coins into the crowd, while peasants jostled for scraps of food or a glance at a spectacle. Music floated over the square loots, drums, flutes, and the occasional bagpipe blending with the shouts of merchants, the braying of animals, and the squeals of children. Everywhere you looked, someone was attempting to entertain, barter, or survive. Even the act of breathing carried risk. Inhale too deeply, and you might find yourself tasting half-rotted cheese or inhaling a cloud of dust that had been swept up from a week's worth of street traffic. Hand hygiene, as we know it, was largely optional. Shaking hands, touching coins, passing food, or leaning against a wooden stall could transfer enough filth to make a modern germaphobe faint on the spot. People didn't wash their hands between handling chickens, money, or sick neighbors. And yet, somehow, life went on. The market and festival were as much about survival as they were about celebration. Peasants learned which vendors could be trusted, which foods were less likely to induce immediate stomach distress, and which performances might end with a dropped torch or flying pastry. Observation, timing, and a healthy dose of luck were as important as currency in navigating the chaos. Even in this swirl of danger, humor flourished. You might step on a slippery cobblestone, narrowly avoiding a pile of mud, only to have a roasted chicken plop at your feet, legs splayed and wings flapping like it had just completed a full circus routine. Children would dart through the crowd, chasing goats or chasing each other, while adults shouted and gestured, creating a symphony of human panic that somehow remained entertaining. The lines between entertainment, survival, and outright chaos were blurred. One moment you were laughing at a jester tumbling into a puddle. The next you were dodging a stray pig that had decided to make a break for it. At every stall, there was a story. One merchant offered miracle cures for coughs, claiming a potion made from honey, ashes, and a pinch of dried lizard skin could cure consumption. Another sold pickled vegetables that might or might not have been preserved properly, depending on whether the jars had been boiled or merely ignored for a fortnight. Coins changed hands, sometimes for the food, sometimes for advice, and sometimes for the privilege of hearing a very loud fiddler play a tune that could be classified as music in certain distant lands. The lessons of these medieval fairs were clear. You needed to pay attention, trust your senses, and never underestimate the chaos that comes with human, animal, and divine participation in the same square. If your eyes weren't constantly scanning for danger, if your nose wasn't assessing the risk of airborne spoilage, and if your reflexes weren't ready to dodge flying pies, you wouldn't last long. And yet, people endured. They laughed, they argued, they cheered, they fought over the last sausage, and they did it all knowing that tomorrow, the same chaos would start anew. Eat that meat pie at your own risk. The plague might just be part of the secret sauce. And if the juggler drops a flaming torch on your coin purse, well, consider it a donation to the local fire department or the afterlife. As the market's chaos stretched into the midday sun, the atmosphere began to shift. The air, already thick with the smell of roasted meat, sweat, and mud, became punctuated with incense, the clang of bells, and the distant thrum of drums. Today wasn't just any market day. It was a festival, a saint's day, a moment when the ordinary chaos of bartering and hustling transformed into something spectacularly, vibrantly, and dangerously theatrical. Merchants hastily erected temporary stalls along the edges of the square, ropes and wooden frames groaning under the weight of brightly dyed fabrics, exotic trinkets, and jars of spices that smelled more like magic than food. The scent of sweet pastries mingled with the sharp tang of spiced ale. And somewhere in the distance, a fire had been lit to roast a pig that was undoubtedly bigger than some of the attending children. Musicians arrived early, claiming spots where their fiddles and drums would be heard above the shouting of the merchants and the bleating of goats being sold as prizes for contests. Acrobats and jugglers staked their corners of the square, balancing precariously on makeshift platforms or on each other's shoulders, while jesters, painted in garish colors, darted through the crowd, tossing pies or performing exaggerated bows to anyone who might tip them a coin. The entire spectacle was a delicate chaos of smells, sounds, and motion. It was as if every sense was under siege, challenged, and entertained all at once. People from the surrounding villages poured in, bringing not just their coins, but their curiosity, their hunger, and their willingness to be trampled by children or bumped by livestock. The noble families arrived in carriages, their silk cloaks trailing behind them like banners of authority. Peasants tried to squeeze closer to the food and the games, mindful of the social hierarchies that dictated who got the best seats near the performances and who had to settle for the edge of the crowd where the mud was deepest. And above it all, the bells rang continuously, a reminder that the festival had divine approval, or at least that someone in the church thought it did. Every festival had its own flavor. Saints' days brought a solemnity mixed with revelry, a paradoxical blend of spiritual devotion and unrestrained human indulgence. Market stalls were decorated with garlands of flowers, ribbons, and the occasional stuffed animal or crude effigy of the saint in question. Children ran from stall to stall, shouting in excitement, tugging at their parents, chasing each other, or occasionally a loose goat, which seemed to regard the festival as its personal playground. Food was central, as always. But now it was elevated pies, stuffed with spiced meats, candied fruits glistening under the sun, roasted meats on spits, and jugs of frothy ale for the grown-ups, all served in portions designed to delight, nourish, and occasionally intoxicate. Temporary market structures accommodated performers and vendors alike. Fiddlers shared space with herbalists, who hawked miracle cures in tiny bottles that smelled faintly of vinegar and disappointment. Jugglers dodged livestock and jostling spectators while trying to keep their flaming torches aloft. Acrobats flipped over carts stacked with cabbages, narrowly missing a harried baker who had just dropped a fresh loaf. The crowd roared in laughter, sympathy, or sheer panic. It was hard to tell which. Even nobles had to navigate the chaos carefully, lest a flying pie or an errant chicken leave a stain on their silk. Religious and civic ceremonies intertwined seamlessly with commerce. Parades announced the arrival of local dignitaries, while minstrels and street performers attempted to entertain in the narrow gaps between processions. At times, the square seemed impossibly crowded. A tangle of animals, merchants, townsfolk, and visiting performers, each vying for attention, each adding to the sensory overload. The air vibrated with a mixture of music, shouting, animal noises, and the faint but unmistakable smell of misadventure roasting meat mixed with mud, spilled ale, and the occasional human mishap. Despite the overwhelming chaos, there was an unspoken rhythm. Vendors shouted their wares in practiced chants. Children ran in predictable circuits between stalls. Acrobats had their cues, and nobles paraded with exaggerated dignity. Everyone knew their place, even if it was precarious. Peasants, forever on the edge between awe and fear, learned quickly that surviving the festival required observation, quick reflexes, and occasionally the willingness to be jostled, bumped, or splashed. There was no formal policing. Instead, social norms and the natural fear of reprisal kept some semblance of order. Food and drink were central not just for sustenance but for survival. The pies, roasted meats, and candied treats that seemed delicious were also often a gamble. Spoilage was common, hygiene minimal, and food poisoning lurked just as nearby as the nearest pickpocket or flying chicken. Portable foods, loaves of bread, hard cheese, dried meats were essential for workers, travelers, and soldiers passing through. These were the medieval energy bars, dense, durable, and often slightly questionable in their freshness, but effective at keeping a body moving through long, chaotic days. Amid all this sensory overload, humor thrived. One might trip over a goat, inhale the aroma of week-old cheese, and be elbowed by a child chasing a duck, all before breakfast. A juggler might send a flaming torch careening into a cart of onions, prompting a collective scream and then laughter, because in the medieval mind, chaos and entertainment were inseparable. A baker might watch in horror as his pies were stolen mid-throw by a nimble-handed street urchin, and a noble might curse under his breath while trying to protect his silk cloak from the mud and madness. It was a world where danger, delight, and absurdity existed in equal measure, and everyone, whether noble or peasant, had to navigate it with wit, courage, and a good sense of humor. The rituals of festivals and special markets were no less dangerous. Processions honoring saints were mixed with games of skill, competitions, and dancing. Winners of contests might be showered with coins, food, or simply the admiration of the crowd, while losers could face embarrassment or a stray pie. Performances were interactive. An audience member could suddenly find themselves the subject of a jester's mockery or an acrobat's accidental collision. And yet, despite the risk of injury, humiliation, or food poisoning, people participated eagerly. Festivals were a respite from the drudgery of everyday life, a chance to experience a little magic, a little chaos, and a little joy, all wrapped together in the smell of roasting meat and the buzz of human energy. You can attend a festival and dodge a dancing goat while sipping ale only in medieval Europe. And if the juggler drops a flaming torch on your toes, consider it part of the entertainment or a donation to the local apothecary. As the festival chaos ebbed into the afternoon, the real backbone of the market revealed itself: the merchants and their guilds. These weren't just random folks with wares stuffed into sacks. They were organized, semi-respected, and occasionally terrifying power players who controlled the flow of goods, prices, and even gossip across the region. Guilds were like medieval trade unions, but with more rules, rituals, and a slightly higher chance of someone being publicly humiliated for touching a loaf of bread with the wrong hand. Membership in a guild meant that a merchant had privileges, protections, and, most importantly, power over who could sell what, where, and at what price. Step outside the rules, and you might find your cart overturned, your barrels dumped, or your prized wares confiscated by a group of outraged tradesmen wielding wooden clubs and righteous indignation. Markets were the lifeblood of the medieval economy, and the guilds were the circulatory system. They regulated the quality of goods, the weights and measures, and the often ridiculous etiquette of transactions. A weaver's guild might dictate exactly how thick your wool needed to be, while the butcher's guild kept a watchful eye on anyone selling meat that didn't meet their exacting, yet somehow arbitrary, standards. You could argue that some of these rules existed to protect consumers, but mostly they protected the guild's profits. And if that meant inspecting a loaf of bread to make sure it had the proper fluff-to-crust ratio, well, so be it. Trade wasn't just local. Markets connected villages, towns, and even regions hundreds of miles apart. Exotic goods traveled through the hands of dozens of intermediaries before landing in a medieval market square, ready to be sniffed, poked, or, occasionally, destroyed by a clumsy merchant. Spices, silks, sugar, and other rare imports were the lifeblood of fashion, cooking, and showmanship. Imagine a barrel of peppercorns traveling from the spice markets of Alexandria to a humble square in France, only for a sneezy, overly enthusiastic merchant to knock it over, sending a cascade of black spheres rolling across the muddy cobblestones. The peasants would scatter, the children would chase the runaway peppercorns, and the guild officials would throw a collective hissy fit, muttering about ruined profits and the sanctity of the trade route. And while the wealthy merchants flaunted their exotic imports, silks dyed in vibrant blues and reds, jars of scented oils, or even live animals for display, the peasants and lesser traders had to improvise. Bartering was an art form, a delicate dance of haggling, bluffing, and occasionally a well-timed accusation of theft or cheating. The stakes were high. A successful trade could mean enough food to survive the next week, while a misstep might leave a merchant's stall empty, a pocketbook lighter, or their reputation tarnished for months. And in a world without social media, word of mouth spread faster than a dropped candle, igniting hay insults, and gossip traveled from stall to stall like wildfire, creating many scandals that could rival any noble court intrigue. Guild influence also extended to quality control in ways both amusing and terrifying. A single cobbler with shoddy shoes might be publicly reprimanded, forced to kneel in the mud, or even have his leather scraps confiscated for the greater good. Meanwhile, master merchants flaunted the latest innovations, candied fruits, exotic nuts, and even rudimentary confections that had traveled hundreds of miles to delight a few rich patrons. Every transaction was a performance, every haggling session a battle, and every pile of goods a tiny empire of chaos waiting to explode under the weight of a miscounted coin or a drop jar of honey. The economic power of the guilds wasn't just in their control of goods, it was in their influence over social life. Guild-sponsored feasts, performances, and even charitable acts displayed both wealth and moral virtue. A guild might sponsor a procession in honor of a local saint, providing bread for the hungry, ale for the thirsty, and entertainment for everyone in between. The clever guildmaster knew that maintaining a favorable public image ensured compliance from local citizens, loyalty from apprentices, and, most importantly, continued profit. Humorously, this influence could reach absurd extremes. One could witness a merchant inspecting a barrel of saffron with exaggerated seriousness, only to sneeze, sending the precious threads flying into the mud. The crowd would gasp. Apprentices would scramble, and the merchant would stomp and shout in a mix of despair and rage. Meanwhile, a young peasant might pocket a few threads, thinking they were fair game, while the noble spectators whispered about the inefficiency of the lower classes. It was a theater of commerce, a spectacle that balanced precariously between awe, amusement, and occasional chaos. Even more fascinating, The guilds and markets connected the world in ways that were invisible but transformative. A spice from Alexandria, a silk from Constantinople, a wine from Bordeaux. Each represented a thread in a vast network of trade that spanned continents. Knowledge, culture, and cuisine traveled alongside the goods. Recipes evolved. Fashions shifted. And even language absorbed foreign words as merchants communicated across the boundaries of dialects and regions. In essence, these markets were not merely places of commerce, they were incubators of civilization, blending practicality with performance, necessity with spectacle, and survival with extravagance. Humorous observation. A barrel of spices traveled hundreds of miles, only to be sniffed by a merchant who sneezes, ruins the batch, and inadvertently creates the first recorded food fight in medieval Europe. Congratulations! Civilization progressed through chaos. By the late afternoon, the market was a tapestry of human endeavor, colorful, chaotic, and slightly dangerous. Nobles strutted past stalls showing off their imported silks. Tradesmen calculated profits and losses with grim determination. Children dodged chickens and occasionally escaped with a stolen loaf of bread. And street performers flitted between crowds, juggling, singing, and performing feats that defied both gravity and common sense. The guilds kept the wheels turning, ensuring that commerce didn't collapse under the weight of unpredictability, and the entire spectacle continued to teach lessons about survival, ingenuity, and social hierarchy. Markets were living organisms, evolving with each festival, fair, and saint's day. They reflected the priorities of a society balancing survival, display, and communal life. Peasants learned which merchants were reliable, which foods were likely to make them sick, and how to pick pockets just enough to survive without drawing the ire of the town guard. Nobles learned how to flaunt their wealth while avoiding humiliation, and guilds cemented their power through regulation, intimidation, and spectacle. In this swirling chaos, medieval society found both function and entertainment, survival and drama, and an education in economics that no modern classroom could replicate. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across cobblestones slick with mud and ale, the market began to empty. Stalls were taken down hastily, goods packed away, and the performers packed their props. Apprentices counted coins with trembling hands, while guildmasters adjusted ledgers, marking profits and losses with grim satisfaction. Nobles returned to their estates, their elaborate clothing and precious imports reflecting the status that had been so carefully curated throughout the day, and peasants trudged home with whatever food, tips, or small treasures they had managed to wrest from the chaotic environment. In essence, medieval markets were more than trade hubs. They were theaters of human ambition, ingenuity, and survival. They demonstrated the precarious balance between order and chaos, wealth and poverty, skill and luck. And through it all, humor, absurdity, and unpredictability permeated every transaction, every performance, and every stolen bite of bread. The lessons of these markets about commerce, community, and creativity under pressure resonated far beyond the cobblestones, leaving a legacy that would shape towns, trade networks, and human interaction for centuries. Buy a roasted goose, haggle for a feather, and hope your coin purse isn't stolen by the town jester. Because in medieval markets, everyone had a role, and sometimes survival was the main act. As the dust settles from the chaos of cobblestones, carts, and wandering livestock, it's time to step back and appreciate what medieval markets truly left behind. Because yes, beyond the haggling, the spilled ale, the clanging of cartwheels, and the occasional panicked scream when a pig escapes, there was a method to the madness, a legacy that still shapes the way we gather, trade, and celebrate today. Imagine, if you will, the first time someone packed up a few spices, a loaf of bread, and a goat cheese wheel, and sold them in a busy town square. They were doing more than surviving. They were creating the blueprint for modern markets, street fairs, and even the occasional festival cotton candy stand. The influence of medieval markets reaches far beyond the surviving relics of old stone streets. Every bustling Saturday market, every festive fair, owes a tip of its hat to these medieval predecessors. They taught us that commerce isn't just about exchanging goods. It's about community, spectacle, and storytelling. Peasants, nobles, and merchants alike played roles in an intricate theater of trade. The notion that people could meet, negotiate, show off, barter, and perform all in one square is something that resonates in modern open-air markets, weekend craft fairs, and even holiday Christmas bazaars. Every stall with handmade goods or exotic treats owes a tiny debt to those chaotic days when medieval traders juggled spices, roasted meats, and their precarious reputations. The lessons from medieval markets are equally enduring. Human ingenuity thrives under pressure, and the ability to adapt to scarcity, surprise, and sometimes outright chaos was honed on these cobblestones. Street vendors learned how to maximize every scrap of food, how to lure in a passing noble with the shine of silver or the scent of fresh bread, and how to survive both the weather and the whims of unpredictable crowds. This wasn't just about making a living. It was about mastering a delicate dance of negotiation, improvisation, and performance art. Modern marketeers and festival organizers still rely on these same principles. Presentation matters, timing matters, and sometimes a little chaos makes everything more memorable. Imagine the first cotton candy machine at a fair. It's messy, sticky, and vaguely terrifying. But it works, much like that first street baker with flour on his nose, selling bread to a crowd that may or may not have been able to pay. Social cohesion was another unsung virtue of these medieval gatherings. Markets were places where the threads of society interwove. A noble might strut past in finery. A peasant scurried with a sack of barley. A merchant haggled loudly over the price of a jar of honey. And a child chased a runaway chicken awl while the town watch squinted at the crowd and muttered prayers. In the chaos, bonds were formed. Debts of gratitude were exchanged. Small alliances were forged between stalls, and information flowed as freely as ale. You could hear news from a neighboring village, learn which baker's bread was trustworthy, and find out if the blacksmith's apprentice had finally stopped breaking tools, all in one morning. This social function of the market, this organic networking hub, is something modern fairs, open-air markets, and even farmers' markets continue to replicate. We exchange not just goods, but stories, jokes, and a sense of shared humanity, often without realizing we're following centuries-old patterns. Then there's the festival aspect. Markets weren't only about survival and trade. They were about joy, spectacle, and brief reprieve from the monotony of medieval life. Music, performances, and sometimes absurd competitions, tug-of-war with a pig, juggling contests, or mock jousts with padded lances, were as integral to the market as the goods themselves. Modern fairs owe this tradition to medieval markets, where entertainment wasn't separate from commerce, it was interwoven. The spectacle drew in larger crowds, increased trade, and gave both sellers and buyers a reason to come together. The idea that a bustling square could function simultaneously as a place of economy, gossip, and amusement is something every modern festival organizer still tries to recreate. Imagine a Renaissance fair today. People in costume, street performers juggling flaming batons, and an aroma of roasted meats filling the air. It's history repeating itself in the best way, with slightly less risk of tripping over manure. The economic influence is just as profound. Medieval markets helped standardize measurements, encourage trade networks, and even introduce some rudimentary forms of quality control through guild oversight. Merchants learned to specialize, import, and experiment with products, paving the way for larger trade networks across towns, regions, and even countries. Without these early marketplaces, it's unlikely that Europe would have developed the bustling trade routes, shipping hubs, and town-based commerce that later fueled the Renaissance and beyond. Every spice you buy, every loaf of artisan bread, every handmade craft item at a modern festival owes a tiny, messy, chaotic thanks to the original street vendors who balanced precariously on cobblestones, trying to make a living while dodging livestock, thieves, and the occasional falling pigeon. Humor, of course, was, and remains, essential. Medieval markets weren't all grim survival. They were absurd, unpredictable, and wonderfully ridiculous. A noble might demand to see every coin in a merchant's purse before haggling. A peasant might trip over a goat, or someone might accidentally trade a sack of barley for a cursed amulet instead of money. Humor softened the hardship, gave people something to talk about, and created memories that made the long, hard days bearable. Modern fairs continue this tradition in less dangerous forms. A clown spilling a jug of water, a poorly timed pie in the face contest, or the inevitable cotton candy disaster, all echoes of the chaos that made medieval markets both terrifying and delightful. So, as the sun sets and the market empties, the lesson is clear. Medieval markets were more than just places to buy and sell. They were epicenters of culture, ingenuity, social interaction, and yes, occasional chaos. They taught us how to survive in the world, how to negotiate, how to entertain, and how to find joy amidst the messiness of life. Next time you wander through a modern farmer's market, haggle for a cheese wheel, or watch a street performer balance on a tightrope, remember, you are participating in a tradition that has been centuries in the making, a living legacy of creativity, human adaptability, and the eternal desire for both sustenance and spectacle. Next time you eat cotton candy or haggle for a souvenir, thank medieval markets. Or at least be glad there's no live chicken chasing you in the aisle, and no merchant demanding you pay in turnips instead of coins. Survive, smile, and maybe duck.